In the heart of New York City, there stands a towering monument to artistic rebellion, the Whitney Museum of American Art. For nearly a century, it has been a beacon of what is new, bold, and uniquely American. But this institution was not born out of quiet charity. It was born out of war, a war declared by a single woman against a society that tried to stifle her. The woman who built it was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Born with a name synonymous with money, her life should have been a perfect, gilded fairy tale. But it wasn't. It was a story of profound loneliness, a humiliating marriage to an unfaithful husband, and the bitter scorn of a world that labeled her a useless heiress. This is the story of how her pain became her power. The story of how a woman rejected by the art world and betrayed in her own home took up hammer and chisel to shatter the gilded cage. She didn't just carve stone, she carved a new destiny for herself and for American art. This is the incredible true story of how one individual's broken heart was forged into an immortal public legacy. At the very pinnacle of this new American aristocracy stood the House of Vanderbilt. The dynasty's patriarch, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, was the stuff of legend. A rough, uneducated, titanically ambitious man from Staten Island, he had started with a single ferry boat and, through sheer ruthlessness and brilliant business acumen, built a shipping and railroad empire that was the largest in the world. The Commodore was old America, crude, powerful, and utterly unimpressed with the airs and graces of high society. He worked, he built, he swore, and he amassed a fortune that, at the time of his death in 1877, was greater than the entire U.S. Treasury. But the generations that followed were different. His son, William Henry, doubled the fortune, but he and his children became obsessed with something the old Commodore had scorned: social acceptance. They wanted to transform their new money into old-world legitimacy, and the only way to do that was to spend it on a scale that the world had never seen before. This was the generation that would build the great Vanderbilt houses, those opulent marble palaces designed to rival the chateaux of French kings and the country seats of English dukes. Gertrude's father was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the Commodore's favorite grandson. He was a man crushed by the weight of his own inheritance. Unlike his swashbuckling grandfather, Cornelius II was a deeply pious, dutiful, and relentlessly hard-working man. He saw the family fortune not as a tool for adventure, but as a sacred, terrifying responsibility. His life was a constant, anxious effort to manage, preserve, and legitimize the Vanderbilt Empire. He was the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, a position that consumed him entirely. His wife and Gertrude's mother was Alice Claypool Gwynn Vanderbilt. If Cornelius II was the anxious guardian of the family's wealth, Alice was the formidable, iron-willed general of its social campaign. She was the quintessential Gilded Age society queen, a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to establishing the Vanderbilts as the undisputed leaders of New York's high society, the exclusive circle of old money families known as the 400. Her life was a meticulously orchestrated performance of power, played out in the ballrooms, dining rooms, and opera boxes of New York and Newport, Rhode Island. This was the world Gertrude was born into, a world of staggering, almost suffocating wealth and equally staggering emotional restraint. Her childhood was not a place of warm, spontaneous affection. It was a highly structured, formal apprenticeship in the duties of being a Vanderbilt. She grew up between two of the most famous houses in American history. The family's winter residence was a colossal block-long mansion at 1 West 57th Street in New York City. It was a dark, imposing fortress of French Renaissance architecture, with over 130 rooms filled with European art, priceless tapestries, and an army of servants. It was less a home and more a private museum designed to intimidate and impress. Their summers were spent in an even more famous cottage in Newport, the Breakers. With its 70 rooms, its construction of Italian marble and alabaster, its grand staircase and soaring ceilings, it was the most magnificent of all the Newport palaces, a jaw-dropping testament to the Vanderbilts' ambition to outshine everyone. But for a young girl, these houses were lonely, echoing spaces. In her own diaries, Gertrude would later write of her childhood as a period of profound isolation. She remembered the endless formal dinners where the children were expected to be silent observers, the long hours spent with governesses, and the feeling of being a small, insignificant figure in a world of overwhelming adult grandeur. She was a sensitive, fiercely intelligent, and deeply introspective child. She devoured books, finding in literature a world of passion and meaning that was absent from her own life. She began keeping a diary at a young age, a secret place where she could pour out her frustrations and her yearnings. These early writings are incredibly revealing. They show a young woman already chafing against the constraints of her destiny. "Oh, the dullness, the hopeless dullness of it all," she wrote of the endless cycle of social engagements. She longed for what she called a great purpose, for a life that was more than just a performance of wealth. Her education, while the best that money could buy, was designed to groom her for this performance. Tutors instructed her in French, in art history, in music, and in the intricate arts of running a great house. It was an education in aesthetics and management, not in critical thinking or independent creativity. The goal was to make her the perfect hostess, the perfect wife to a powerful man, the perfect mother to the next generation of heirs. The idea that she might want to create something of her own, to be an artist or an intellectual in her own right, was simply not a part of the equation. It was an unthinkable, almost alien concept for a woman of her class and time. As she entered her late teens, the pressure of this destiny intensified. The Vanderbilt machine began the process of preparing her for the most important transaction of her life, her marriage. She was officially introduced to society in a lavish debutante ball held at the Breakers in the summer of 1895. It was the social event of the year. The grounds were illuminated with thousands of electric lights, still a novelty at the time, and an orchestra played for hundreds of guests who represented the pinnacle of American and European society. Gertrude, dressed in a breathtaking white satin gown by the House of Worth in Paris, was the undisputed star of the evening. She was by all accounts a striking beauty, not in a delicate, fragile way, but with a strong, statuesque presence, a direct, intelligent gaze, and an air of quiet, almost melancholy dignity. The ball was her public unveiling on the Gilded Age marriage market. Suitors from noble European families and wealthy American dynasties began to present themselves. But there was one man who stood out from the rest, a man who seemed to embody a thrilling escape from the staid, dutiful world of her father. His name was Harry Payne Whitney. If Gertrude was a princess of the railroad, Harry was a prince of finance and industry. His father, William C. Whitney, was a massively wealthy and powerful financier who had served as Secretary of the Navy. His mother was the daughter of an oil baron who was a partner in Standard Oil. The Whitney family was as rich and powerful as the Vanderbilts, but they wore their wealth with a different air. They were less formal, more athletic, and possessed a dashing, almost reckless charm. And Harry was the epitome of this. He was handsome, charismatic, and one of the most celebrated sportsmen of his generation. A graduate of Yale, he was a champion polo player, a world-class yachtsman, and a renowned breeder of thoroughbred racehorses. Where Gertrude's world was one of indoor propriety and hushed tones, Harry's was a world of thundering hooves, of salt spray on the deck of a racing yacht, of masculine energy and effortless, aristocratic confidence. For a young woman who felt trapped in a life of hopeless dullness, Harry must have seemed like a force of nature, a promise of a life of excitement, freedom, and passion. He was everything her serious, burdened father was not. Gertrude fell deeply and genuinely in love. He was charmed by her beauty, her intelligence, and undoubtedly by the immense prestige of her family name. To the outside world, it was the perfect union, a merger of two of America's greatest fortunes, a match that solidified the power of this new, untitled aristocracy. Her parents approved. His parents approved. Society was ecstatic. On August 25, 1896, in a ceremony that was hailed by the newspapers as the wedding of the century, Gertrude Vanderbilt and Harry Payne Whitney were married at the Breakers in Newport. Thousands of onlookers gathered outside the gates to catch a glimpse of the couple. The bride wore a magnificent gown with a 15-foot train, and the wedding gifts displayed for the press were valued in the millions of dollars. It was the ultimate Gilded Age fairy tale. The beautiful heiress had married the handsome prince. They were destined to become the undisputed king and queen of New York society. As Gertrude stood at the altar, she must have believed that she had finally found her great purpose in the great love she felt for her new husband. The long, lonely years of her youth were over. A brilliant, happy future stretched before her. But the very qualities that had drawn her to Harry, his restless energy, his love of the chase, his insatiable appetite for life, would soon become the very instruments of her deepest and most profound heartbreak. The fairy tale was about to turn into a long and private nightmare. The fairy tale wedding was a masterpiece of Gilded Age theater, a public spectacle that seemed to guarantee a perfect future. But a marriage is not lived on the day of the ceremony. It is lived in the quiet, unphotographed moments that follow. As the applause faded and the last of the champagne was cleared away, Gertrude and Harry stepped off the public stage and into the private reality of their new life together. It was here, behind the magnificent closed doors of their new home, that the thrilling promises of their courtship would be tested against the stark, day-to-day truth of two profoundly different souls. The perfect union, celebrated by the world, was about to face its first and most significant internal fractures. In the immediate aftermath of the wedding of the century, the life of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was on the surface the perfect embodiment of the Gilded Age dream fulfilled. She had transitioned seamlessly from being the most eligible heiress in America to the brilliant young wife of its most celebrated sportsman and financier. Together, they were an undeniable power couple, a union of colossal fortunes and dynastic prestige that placed them at the absolute apex of New York society. Their life was a whirlwind of motion between magnificent, fully staffed homes. There was the imposing mansion at 871 Fifth Avenue in New York, a gift from Harry's father, which Gertrude and her architects would spend years transforming into a veritable Italian palace. There was their sprawling country estate in Old Westbury, Long Island, where Harry could indulge his passion for horses. And of course, there were the obligatory summers in Newport, residing in the orbit of her mother's grand court at the Breakers. They were young, beautiful, impossibly wealthy, and for a brief, shining moment it seemed that Gertrude had indeed found the vibrant, exciting life she had so desperately craved. The marriage also brought her a role that she would cherish with a fierce, profound devotion for the rest of her life: motherhood. In 1897, their first child, Flora, was born. She was followed by Cornelius Vanderbilt's Sonny Whitney in 1899, and finally their second daughter, Barbara, in 1903. For Gertrude, her children became the undisputed center of her emotional universe. In a world defined by formality and superficiality, the unconditional, tangible love she felt for them was a powerful and grounding force. It gave her a sense of purpose that the endless cycle of social engagements never could. She adored her children, and in these early years, the image of the perfect family seemed complete. The Whitneys were the living, breathing ideal of American aristocracy. But a photograph, no matter how perfect, only captures a single, frozen instant. Behind the placid smiles and the magnificent backdrops, two very different lives were being lived under the same roof, and a vast, silent chasm was beginning to open between them. The chasm was one of temperament, of passion, and ultimately of purpose. Harry Payne Whitney was a man defined by action and conquest. His world was outdoors, in the company of men on the field of sport. His life was a thrilling sequence of competitions. He was the captain of America's most famous polo team, leading them to international victory against the British. He was a master yachtsman, a daring automobile racer, and most famously, the proprietor of the Whitney stables, which he developed into the most dominant thoroughbred horse racing and breeding operation in North America. His days were filled with the thunder of hooves, the strategy of the game, the thrill of the win. His evenings were often spent not in the formal drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, but in the smoky, convivial atmosphere of his exclusive men's clubs, the Knickerbocker, the Racket, and Tennis Club, places where business was done, brandy was drunk, and women like his wife were not permitted. Gertrude's world, by contrast, was almost entirely indoors. It was a world of rigid schedules and stifling obligations. Her days were a relentless parade of duties, prescribed for a woman of her station. There was the morning consultation with the household staff to approve menus and plan for dinner parties. There was the endless ritual of visiting, of leaving calling cards at the homes of other society women in a complex, unwritten dance of social hierarchy. There were the afternoons spent presiding over charity committee meetings, where her role, as she saw it with growing bitterness, was simply to be a Vanderbilt, a name that could be relied upon to sign a large check. In her diaries, she raged against the futility of it all. "They are all alike," she wrote of her fellow society matrons, "perfectly dressed and no expression, no ideas, no nothing." She felt like an actress in a play she had not chosen, speaking lines that had no meaning. The vibrant, intelligent young woman who had thrilled to the intellectual debates of her youth was now trapped in a world where the most pressing topics of conversation were the guest list for the next ball or the latest society scandal. The profound loneliness she had felt as a child in the echoing halls of her parents' mansions had returned, but this time it was sharper, more painful, because it was a loneliness she shared with her husband. For it was not just their interests that diverged, it was their very souls, and Harry began to seek companionship elsewhere. The Gilded Age operated on a brutal double standard. A husband's infidelity, particularly for a man of Harry Whitney's power and magnetism, was not only common, but often tacitly accepted, as long as a certain level of discretion was maintained. Harry, however, was not always discreet. His affairs became an open secret. Whispers that followed Gertrude into every ballroom and opera box. She was a woman publicly betrayed, and yet she was expected by the codes of her class to endure it with a dignified, silent smile. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison, eroding her confidence, her trust, and the very foundation of the love she had once felt so powerfully. She was trapped. Divorce was unthinkable. a scandal that would bring shame upon both the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys. She was a mother of 3 young children, and so she turned inward, her private diaries becoming the sole repository for a grief and a rage she could show to no one. "Oh, the awful loneliness of a life in which one has to live for others," she wrote. "Oh, the tragedy of a woman's life. We are not suited to it, and we are not fitted for anything else." She was descending into a profound depression, a state of spiritual paralysis. The beautiful gilded cage had become a prison, and she could see no way out. By the early 1900s, the strain had become unbearable. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the queen of New York society, suffered a complete nervous breakdown. In 1901, on the advice of her doctors, Gertrude did the only thing she could do. She escaped. She embarked on a long trip to Europe, a journey that was less a grand tour and more a desperate search for healing, for a reason to go on. It was in the museums of Spain, Italy, and especially Paris that she found the first glimmer of a new path. She wandered the halls of the Louvre, but it was in the studios of contemporary artists that she felt a true spark of recognition. And one artist, above all, spoke to the turmoil in her soul: Auguste Rodin. Imagine Gertrude, a woman raised in a world of polished, idealized, and emotionally sterile art, standing before Rodin's work for the first time. Here was sculpture that was not polite. It was raw, powerful, and writhing with a psychological intensity she recognized in herself. Figures like the Thinker or the Kiss were not just beautiful forms. They were expressions of profound human struggle, of passion, of despair. Rodin's sculptures were not afraid of ugliness, of pain, of the messy, complicated truth of human experience. He made art out of the very emotions she had been forced to suppress her entire life. For Gertrude, it was a revelation. It was a permission slip. Art, she was beginning to understand, was not just something you bought to decorate a mansion. It was something you could do. It was a way to give form to the formless chaos of the inner world. This European sojourn was the beginning of her rebirth. She returned to America not cured of her sadness, but armed with a new sense of possibility. The idea of becoming an artist herself, an idea that would have once seemed preposterous, began to take root in her mind. It was a secret, tentative, but deeply thrilling thought. She began to seek out instruction, a radical act for a woman in her position. She couldn't simply enroll in a public class, so she began by taking private lessons, hiring a tutor to teach her the fundamentals of sculpture in the privacy of her own home in Westbury. But this was not enough. She yearned for the serious, rigorous environment of real artists. And so she took the next, even more daring step. She enrolled at the prestigious Art Students League of New York. Think about the audacity of this. This was not a finishing school for society girls. The League was a serious bohemian institution, a place of intense work and radical ideas. For Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney to walk through its doors was a profound act of class transgression. She would have been working alongside poor, aspiring artists, immigrants, and political radicals, people her own family would have considered utterly beyond the pale. She studied under masters like James Earl Fraser, a sculptor known for his monumental and emotionally resonant works. And she discovered something extraordinary. She had talent, a real, undeniable talent. More than that, she had found her calling. The physical, demanding work of sculpture, the mess of the clay, the heft of the armature, the sheer force required to shape a medium, was a powerful antidote to the passive, ornamental life she had been forced to live. For the first time, she was not just observing, she was creating. She was in control. The act of making art was an act of taking power. But she could not be a full-time student forever, and she could not work in the stifling formality of her Fifth Avenue home. She needed a space of her own, a world apart from her life as Mrs. Whitney. She found it in a place that was, geographically, just a few miles from her mansion, but culturally was on another planet, Greenwich Village. Specifically, she found it in McDougal Alley, a small cobblestone mews tucked away behind the brownstones of Washington Square North. The alley was a collection of old carriage houses and stables that had been converted into studios by a community of sculptors. It was the heart of New York's burgeoning bohemian scene, a place where the rigid rules of uptown society simply did not apply. In 1907, she rented a studio there, a modest two-story former stable at number 19. This studio became her sanctuary, her secret kingdom. Here she was not a Vanderbilt. She was not Mrs. Harry Payne Whitney. She was Gertrude, the sculptor. She would arrive in her chauffeured car dressed in the height of fashion, and then inside the studio walls, she would change into a simple artist's smock and immerse herself in her work. The studio was a place of glorious creative chaos. It was filled with clay dust, with half-finished sculptures shrouded in damp cloths, with the tools of her trade. It was a world she had built for herself, and it was the first place she had ever truly felt at home. This double life was, of course, a source of immense tension. Her husband, Harry, was reportedly bewildered and largely dismissive of her artistic ambitions. While he himself was a patron of certain artists, particularly the gritty, realist painters of the Ashcan School, the idea of his own wife pursuing art with such seriousness seemed to strike him as an eccentric, slightly embarrassing hobby. For her mother Alice, it was even worse. It was a breach of decorum, an unseemly public display that threatened the family's carefully constructed image of dignified propriety. But Gertrude persevered. The studio in McDougal Alley was more than just a workplace. It was the headquarters of her rebellion. It became a salon, a gathering place for the very artists that the uptown establishment ignored. She had an unerring eye for new groundbreaking talent, and she began to use her immense wealth not just to create her own art, but to support the art of others. She offered financial support, encouragement, and most importantly, a place to show their work. She was becoming a patron, but a new kind of patron, not a distant benefactor who wrote checks, but an engaged, passionate participant, an artist among artists. Her own work was evolving, becoming bolder and more confident. She began to exhibit her sculptures, sometimes under a pseudonym to ensure they were judged on their own merits. In 1910, she won an honorable mention for a small sculpture of a faun at the Paris Salon. The following year, she received a commission for a major public monument, the Aztec Fountain for the Pan American Union Building in Washington, D.C. These were not the achievements of a hobbyist. She was earning the respect of her peers and the art world, one commission, one exhibition at a time. The most powerful expressions of her art, however, came from a place of deep personal and public sorrow. In 1912, the world was horrified by the sinking of the Titanic. The tragedy had a profound effect on Gertrude. She was particularly moved by the stories of the men who had given their lives to save women and children. In response, she designed the Women's Titanic Memorial in Washington, D.C., a powerful 18-foot-tall granite figure of a man with his arms outstretched in a gesture of ultimate sacrifice. The sculpture was a testament to her growing skill in capturing profound emotion in monumental form. But an even more personal tragedy would strike 3 years later. In 1915, her beloved younger brother Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, a man known for his heroism and charm, was a passenger on the RMS Lusitania when it was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat. Alfred, like the men of the Titanic, refused a place in a lifeboat, instead spending his final moments giving his own life jacket to a woman and helping children to safety. He went down with the ship. The loss was devastating for Gertrude. She had lost a brother, a friend, a kindred spirit who understood her in a way few others did. Once again, she turned to her art to process her grief. The war memorials she would create in the years to come, particularly those for the First World War, are imbued with a deep personal understanding of loss, a palpable sense of sorrow that could only have come from a heart that had been broken. Through the crucible of her unhappy marriage and the forging fire of her art, a new Gertrude was emerging. She was no longer just a society wife living a double life. She was becoming a major force in the American art world, a woman who was finding her own power, her own voice, and her own great purpose. She was slowly, painstakingly sculpting a new identity for herself. And this was only the beginning. In the sanctuary of her Greenwich Village studio, Gertrude had begun the painstaking work of sculpting a new self, a secret identity forged in clay and bronze. This fragile, bifurcated existence, the dutiful society wife uptown, the passionate rebel artist downtown, provided a desperate kind of equilibrium. But such a delicate balance cannot hold forever, especially when the tremors of history begin to shake the world. The private, personal war Gertrude was waging for her own soul was about to be dwarfed by a global conflict that would demand more than quiet rebellion. The Great War would drag her out of the shadows, testing her strength not just as an artist, but as a leader and a witness to human suffering on a scale she could never have imagined. The double life that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had so carefully constructed, the glittering society queen by night, the serious smock-clad sculptor by day, could not remain in separate orbits forever. A force was gathering on the world stage that would shatter old certainties, redraw maps, and demand a level of engagement that went far beyond the polite confines of a charity committee or the private sanctuary of a studio. The Great War in Europe, which had already claimed the life of her beloved brother Alfred on the Lusitania, was about to pull America and Gertrude herself directly into its vortex. And in the crucible of this unprecedented global conflict, the tentative private artist would be forged into a woman of formidable public action, and her art would find its most powerful and tragic voice. When the United States officially entered the First World War in April 1917, Gertrude, like many women of her class, felt a patriotic call to action. But her response was not to roll bandages at a society tea. That was not her way. Her approach was direct, practical, and on a scale that only a Vanderbilt Whitney could conceive. The reports coming back from France were horrifying, telling of overwhelmed field hospitals and a desperate need for medical facilities. So Gertrude decided she would simply build one. Using her own immense funds, she established and equipped a fully operational 225-bed hospital in Juilly, a town about 30 miles northeast of Paris, perilously close to the fighting on the Western Front. This was not a token gesture. It was a massive logistical undertaking, a project she personally oversaw with the efficiency of a railroad baron. She sailed to France herself, braving the U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic, and worked on the ground, not as a visiting dignitary, but as a hands-on administrator. She organized supply chains, managed staff, and, in her most direct contribution, she walked the wards. She spent hours talking with the grievously wounded men, French soldiers, and later American doughboys, listening to their stories, writing letters home for them, and bearing witness to the brutal human cost of the war. This experience changed her irrevocably. The abstract concept of sorrow, which she had known through her own lonely marriage and the loss of her brother, was now given 1,000 new faces. She saw up close the reality of bodies shattered by shrapnel and minds broken by shell shock. This raw, unfiltered exposure to human suffering stripped away the last vestiges of her Gilded Age insulation. It deepened her empathy and hardened her resolve, and it poured directly into her art. When she returned to her studio in New York, she was no longer content to sculpt fawns or allegorical fountains. Her work became infused with a new tragic gravitas. She began to create some of the most powerful and emotionally honest war memorials in America. These were not the triumphant flag-waving statues of glorious generals that were common at the time. Gertrude's monuments were about the soldiers themselves, their sacrifice, their suffering, and the profound grief of those they left behind. Look at her Washington Heights and Inwood War Memorial in New York City. The figures of the soldiers are not idealized heroes. They are weary, determined men, their faces etched with the grim reality of the trenches. Or consider her monumental sculpture for the memorial at Saint-Nazaire, France, commemorating the landing of the first American troops. It depicts an American soldier standing on the back of an eagle, his sword raised, a figure of immense power and purpose. It became an iconic image of America's role in the war. Through these public commissions, Gertrude was not just making a name for herself as a major sculptor. She was shaping the very way a nation remembered its greatest trauma. She was giving public form to a collective grief, a grief she now understood in the most intimate and personal of ways. The end of the war unleashed a new kind of energy in America. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of profound social and cultural upheaval. A generation that had survived the trenches was in no mood to return to the stuffy, polite conventions of the past. It was an age of rebellion, of new freedoms for women, of jazz music, and of explosive creativity. And nowhere was this energy more concentrated than in the art world. A battle was being waged for the very soul of American art, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, now a seasoned artist and a woman of the world, was about to choose her side decisively and forever. The conflict was between two opposing forces. On one side was the entrenched establishment, embodied by the powerful and deeply conservative National Academy of Design and the august Metropolitan Museum of Art. For them, great art was traditional, academic, and preferably European. They championed painters who emulated the old masters and sculptors who adhered to classical ideals. On the other side were the rebels, a diverse and fractious group of artists who believed that American art should reflect American life in all its gritty, modern, and often unbeautiful reality. This rebellion had been brewing for years. It had started with the so-called Ashcan School, a group of realist painters led by the charismatic Robert Henri. Artists like John Sloan, George Bellows, and George Lukes were turning their backs on polite drawing room scenes and were instead painting the teeming, chaotic life of New York's immigrant neighborhoods, back alleys, and boxing rings. The establishment was horrified. They called the work vulgar, crude, a celebration of ugliness. Then, in 1913, the legendary Armory Show had detonated the American art scene, introducing a stunned public to the radical movements of the European avant-garde, Cubism, Fauvism, the shocking revolutionary works of artists like Picasso, Matisse, and Marcel Duchamp. For a generation of young American artists, the Armory Show was a call to arms, a permission slip to break every rule. They began to experiment to create an art that was uniquely their own, a fusion of American subject matter and European modernism. Gertrude was unequivocally on the side of the rebels. Her own artistic journey had been a rebellion against the polite and the conventional. She saw in these struggling artists a reflection of her own fight for a life of authenticity. Her studio in McDougal Alley was already their unofficial headquarters, a safe haven from the hostile, dismissive world of the uptown academies. She didn't just sympathize with them, she understood them, and she decided to use her two greatest assets, her fortune and her growing influence, to become their champion. Her first major move in 1914 was to transform the space next door to her own studio into a public gallery, which she called the Whitney Studio. Its mission was simple and revolutionary: to show the work of living American artists who were being ignored by the mainstream galleries. Soon after, as more and more artists flocked to her circle, she expanded her vision. In 1918, she purchased the brownstone next door and established the Whitney Studio Club. The club was more than just a gallery. It was a lifeline. It was a social hub, a library, a sketch class, a place where a young, broke artist could get a free meal, a warm fire, and the company of their peers. It was the beating heart of Bohemian New York. Presiding over this vibrant world alongside Gertrude was the woman who would become her indispensable partner in this great enterprise, Juliana Force. Force was everything Gertrude was not. Where Gertrude was reserved, aristocratic, and quietly determined, Juliana was a whirlwind of energy, brash, outspoken, with a brilliant mind for business and an encyclopedic knowledge of the art world. She was Gertrude's field general, her chief strategist, her fiercest advocate. Together, this unlikely duo, the patrician heiress and the dynamic middle-class administrator, formed one of the most formidable partnerships in the history of American art. It was Gertrude's vision and money, but it was Juliana's energy and savvy that made the machine run. Throughout the 1920s, the Whitney Studio Club was the most important venue for progressive art in America. The list of artists who were given their first major shows there reads like a who's who of 20th century American art. Edward Hopper, Stuart Davis, John Sloan, Reginald Marsh. Gertrude and Juliana didn't just show their work, they bought it. Gertrude's personal collection was growing at a staggering rate, becoming a comprehensive archive of this revolutionary period in American culture. There's a legendary story about the painter Edward Hopper, who is now considered one of the giants of American art. In 1920, the Whitney Studio Club gave Hopper his first solo show. Nothing sold. His commercial breakthrough came in 1924 at Frank K. M. Wren Gallery. The Whitney Circle later became crucial collectors of his work. Not a single painting sold. In a gesture of profound faith and generosity, Gertrude purchased his entire exhibition. That sale gave Hopper the financial and emotional freedom to quit his day job and dedicate himself to his art. It is not an exaggeration to say that without Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the world might never have known the lonely, luminous masterpieces of Edward Hopper. And his was just one of dozens of careers that she personally saved and nurtured. By the end of the decade, Gertrude found herself in a unique position. She had, almost by accident, assembled the single greatest collection of contemporary American art in the world. Her collection comprised over 500 paintings, drawings, and sculptures, a definitive statement on the vitality and importance of her country's artists. But she knew that for this art and for these artists to be truly legitimized, they needed to be accepted by the ultimate arbiter of taste, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1929, she made a proposal that she believed was a grand and generous act of public service. She offered to donate her entire priceless collection to the Met, and she didn't stop there. She also offered to provide the funds to build and endow a brand new wing to house it, a permanent dedicated space for American art within the hallowed halls of the nation's most prestigious museum. It was a gift of staggering proportions, a ready-made solution to the Met's well-known neglect of homegrown talent. She expected, at the very least, a serious consideration. She probably expected a grateful acceptance. The response she received was neither. It was a swift, summary, and deeply condescending rejection. The Met's director at the time, a patrician scholar named Edward Robinson, looked at her collection with undisguised disdain. He and his board of trustees, men from the same rarefied social world as Gertrude's own father, saw her collection not as a treasure, but as a motley assortment of second-rate, radical, and even ugly works. The gritty urban scenes of the Ashcan painters, the bold, formal experiments of the modernists. This was not art with a capital A. It was certainly not worthy of hanging alongside their Rembrandts and their Titians. The offer was officially, and rather coldly, declined. This rejection was more than just a professional disappointment. It was a deeply personal wound, a profound slap in the face. The establishment, the very world she had been born into, but had tried so hard to transcend, was shutting the door on her. They were not just dismissing the art she had championed, they were dismissing her. Her vision, her passion, her 20 years of dedicated work. It was all, in their eyes, worthless. According to Juliana Force, who was with her when the news arrived, Gertrude's reaction moved through several stages in a matter of minutes. First, there was a stunned, wounded silence. Then came a flash of pure, incandescent rage. And then, out of that rage, a steely, unshakable resolve. The story goes that after a few moments of contemplation, she turned to Juliana, her eyes blazing, and uttered the words that would change American art history. "All right then," she said. "If they won't have it, we'll start a museum of our own." It was a declaration of war, a war against the snobbery, the Eurocentrism, and the timid conservatism of the old guard. If the mountain would not come to Muhammad, then Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney would build a new, better mountain of her own. The condescending rejection from the Met was the greatest mistake they ever made. They thought they were dismissing a meddlesome society woman. In reality, they had just given birth to their greatest rival, and in the process, had unleashed a force that would define the future. The Whitney Museum of American Art was about to be born. For 2 decades, Gertrude had tirelessly built a parallel art world, a vibrant ecosystem of rebellion and creativity that stood as a direct challenge to the stuffy establishment. Her offer to the Metropolitan Museum was not a plea for acceptance, but a magnanimous invitation for the old world to embrace the new. The Met's cold refusal was more than just an institutional decision. It was a declaration of cultural war. It was the ultimate dismissal from the very class she was born into, a final confirmation that her vision for American art would never find a home in their hallowed halls. And in that moment of profound insult, a new resolve was forged in fire. The time for asking for permission was over. The time for building an empire had begun. Rejection can be a paralyzing force. For many, it is an endpoint, a confirmation of their inadequacy. But for Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum's condescending refusal was not an endpoint. It was a detonation. It was the final liberating insult that severed her last remaining ties to the establishment she was born into and transformed her quiet 20-year rebellion into an all-out war. She would not beg for a seat at their table. She would build a new, better table of her own. And she would do it with a speed and a decisiveness that left the art world utterly breathless. With Juliana Force as her indefatigable general, Gertrude launched her counterattack. The mission was no longer simply to support artists. It was to build a permanent, unassailable fortress for their work. She purchased the adjoining properties to her Whitney Studio Club on West 8th Street, and with the architect Noel L. Miller, she began the radical process of transforming a series of historic brownstones into a single, unified, and thoroughly modern museum. The very design of the building was a statement of intent. This was not to be another marble-clad palace like the Met, designed to awe and intimidate the public. The interior of the new Whitney Museum of American Art was revolutionary for its time. It was clean, functional, and intimate, with stark white walls, innovative lighting, and flexible partitions that could be moved to accommodate the art itself. It was a space designed not to celebrate the wealth of its founder, but to celebrate the work on its walls. It was a museum built from an artist's perspective, a place where the art was the star, not the architecture. And the museum's founding philosophy, its very reason for being, was just as radical. In her own words, Gertrude declared its mission was to be a home for the art of our own country, a truly American art. Its focus would be on living, working artists, the very people the establishment ignored. It would not wait for an artist to be dead and canonized before acquiring their work. It would buy their art when they were young, when they were struggling, when the support meant the most. The museum was founded not as a passive repository of historical artifacts, but as an active, breathing participant in the ongoing story of American creativity. On November 18, 1931, in the very depths of the Great Depression, the Whitney Museum of American Art officially opened its doors to the public. The timing was extraordinary. While breadlines snaked through the streets of New York and the nation's financial system was in a state of collapse, here was an institution born of immense private wealth, a defiant gesture of faith in the enduring power of culture. The opening night was not the typical uptown gala of Vanderbilts and Astors. The crowd was a vibrant, eclectic mix of the artists whose work hung on the walls, Greenwich Village bohemians, critics, and students. It was a celebration not of high society, but of a creative community. With its inaugural exhibition, featuring a selection from Gertrude's own magnificent collection, the Whitney immediately established itself as the most important institution in the world dedicated to modern American art. The useless heiress had taken the ultimate revenge on those who had dismissed her. She had not just built a museum, she had created a new center of gravity in the art world, one that would champion the rebellious, the innovative, and the truly American for generations to come. The creation of the Whitney Museum was the great public triumph of Gertrude's life, the culmination of her long journey from silent wife to cultural force. But as she entered her late 50s, her private world, which had long been a source of such turmoil, was also undergoing a profound and final transformation. Her relationship with Harry Payne Whitney had, over the decades, settled into a kind of weary, aristocratic truce. They never divorced. To do so would have been an unthinkable scandal. Instead, they lived largely separate lives, each presiding over their own domain. He, the king of the sporting world, she the queen of the art world. It was a partnership in name only, a hollowed-out shell of the grand romance it had once promised to be. Then, in 1930, just a year before her museum was set to open, Harry died suddenly of a lung infection. He was only 58 years old. His death made Gertrude a widow, and for the first time in her adult life, a completely independent woman. She was now the sole matriarch of her family and the absolute master of her own colossal fortune. This new, unassailable power would soon be tested in the most public and personally devastating way imaginable, in a scandal that would grip the nation and forever color her public image. The battle for her niece, Gloria Vanderbilt. The saga was a Gilded Age tragedy in its own right. Gertrude's younger brother, Reginald Reggie Vanderbilt, had been the black sheep of the family, a charming, dissolute alcoholic and gambler who had burned through his inheritance with spectacular speed. He died in 1925, leaving behind his beautiful 20-year-old wife, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, and their infant daughter, also named Gloria, who was now the heiress to a multi-million-dollar trust fund. The young widow, Gloria Morgan, was not equipped for the rigid world of the Vanderbilts. She was a modern, pleasure-seeking woman who spent much of her time in Paris and London, living a glamorous, fast life, often leaving her daughter in the care of nannies and relatives. For Gertrude, who valued duty, stability, and the sanctity of the Vanderbilt name above all else, her sister-in-law's lifestyle was anathema. She saw her young niece, little Gloria, as a lonely, neglected child being raised in an environment that was, in her words, without supervision, unstable, and improper. In 1934, Gertrude made a decision that would explode into one of the most sensational legal battles of the 20th century. She sued for custody of her 10-year-old niece. The trial that followed was not just a custody hearing, it was a culture war, a public dissection of the Vanderbilt family's secrets that was breathlessly reported in newspapers around the world. It became known as the trial of the century. On one side was Gertrude, portrayed in the press as a fantastically wealthy, cold, and domineering matriarch, using her fortune to steal a child from her loving mother. On the other was Gloria Morgan, depicted as a beautiful, tragic young widow being persecuted by her monstrously powerful in-laws. The courtroom testimony was the stuff of tabloid dreams, filled with lurid accusations against the mother of wild parties, financial irresponsibility, and most scandalously for the time, a lesbian affair with a member of the British royal family. Servants were brought to the stand to testify about the mother's neglect, while the child herself gave heartbreaking testimony about her loneliness. Why did Gertrude do it? Why did this intensely private woman willingly subject herself and her family to such a humiliating public spectacle? Her motivations were undoubtedly complex. There was a genuine, fierce, and protective love for her niece, and a sincere belief that she was rescuing her from a damaging upbringing. But there was also surely a powerful sense of dynastic duty. She was the guardian of the Vanderbilt legacy, and she saw it as her responsibility to ensure the next generation was raised with the proper values. It was also perhaps the ultimate expression of her own hard-won power. After decades of being a powerless wife, she was now a woman of immense authority, and she was not afraid to use it to impose her will and her vision of what her family should be. In the end, after weeks of sensational headlines, the judge ruled in Gertrude's favor. She won custody of little Gloria, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The trial had been a brutal, emotionally devastating affair that left deep and lasting scars on everyone involved. It forever estranged Gertrude from her niece, who would grow up to resent the strict, controlled environment of her aunt's home. And in the eyes of much of the public, the trial solidified an image of Gertrude not as a visionary arts patron, but as a cold, calculating, and unfeeling millionaire. It was a tragic coda to a life that had so often been misunderstood. The final years of Gertrude's life were lived largely out of the glare of the public spotlight. She retreated into the two worlds she had built for herself, her family and her museum. She poured her energy into overseeing the Whitney, which, under the continued direction of Juliana Force, was flourishing, cementing its reputation as the essential home for American art. She continued her own sculpting. Though less prolifically, her work a constant source of private solace. When the Second World War broke out, she once again threw her support behind the war effort, organizing exhibitions at the museum for the benefit of soldiers. She had lived through two distinct epochs of American history, from the supreme confidence of the Gilded Age to the anxiety and uncertainty of a world at war for the second time. She had witnessed the invention of the automobile, the airplane, and the motion picture. And through it all, she had completed her own personal revolution. She had started life as an object, a name, an heiress. She would end it as a subject, a creator, a founder. In the spring of 1942, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died after a long illness. She was 67 years old. In her will, she ensured that the institution she had created would survive her, leaving the Whitney Museum an endowment of $2.5 million, a massive sum that guaranteed its independence and its future. It was her final and most enduring act of patronage. So what is the final lasting legacy of the woman who was born in a gilded cage? It stands today on the banks of the Hudson River in downtown Manhattan, a magnificent monument of glass and steel. After her death, the Whitney Museum of American Art continued to grow in size and stature. It moved uptown into the iconic modernist building designed by Marcel Breuer, and in 2015 returned to its downtown bohemian roots in a spectacular new home. It has remained true for nearly a century to its founder's radical vision. It continues to champion living artists, to challenge conventions, and to tell the ongoing, evolving story of American art. Its legendary biennial exhibition remains the most important survey of contemporary art in the country. Gertrude's life was a masterclass in the alchemy of the human spirit. She took the lead of her personal pain, the loneliness, the betrayal, the humiliation, and spun it into the gold of a lasting cultural legacy. She was a profound contradiction, an aristocrat who became the patron saint of rebels, a woman of immense privilege who dedicated her life to giving a voice to those who were ignored. Her story is a powerful testament to the idea that our circumstances do not have to be our destiny. It is a reminder that the most profound acts of creation are often born from the deepest wounds. She began her life as Gertrude Vanderbilt, a name that meant railroads and money. She became Mrs. Harry Payne Whitney, a name that meant society and sport. But she died as Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a name that will forever mean art, American art. She was the useless heiress who proved to be one of the most useful and visionary women of her time. She did not just collect art, she shaped a culture. And in the house that Gertrude built, her defiant, generous, and truly American spirit lives on.